So, when you buy a new smartphone or like a new laptop, the very first thing you do is, you check for the system update.
Right, immediately.
Yeah, you want the latest software, the optimized battery life, the little patch that fixes all those hidden bugs running in the background. It's just totally straightforward process.
Totally automatic.
Exactly. But when you actually look at your own mind, this, incredibly complex biological supercomputer we all have, there is there's no update button.
Which is incredibly frustrating.
Right, because when you're feeling stagnant or just overwhelmed or intellectually bloated, you can't just plug a USB cable into your ear and like download a patch to operate at your peak. The mechanics of actually upgrading our cognitive software are, well, they're honestly pretty murky.
Oh, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
I mean, we universally recognize the need for a mental upgrade, especially if you're operating in high-pressure environments. But the user manual for human cognition it's notoriously missing.
Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. Because today is Saturday, April 18th, 2026, and we are looking for the ultimate shortcut to a real cognitive upgrade.
Genuine mental well-being.
Yes, and self-fulfillment. And to map this out for you, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of source material today. We've got a rigorous comparative analysis of journaling versus reading.
Which is so good, by the way.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
We've also got a synthesis of diverse AI consensus models mapping the benefits of both. And this deeply provocative essay titled The Intellectual Respiratory System.
Right.
We are basically bypassing the superficial self-help advice and looking directly at the biological and psychological levers that, rewire the brain in real time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think what's so remarkable about this collection of analysis is that it takes two activities we usually just dismiss as,
Hobbies.
yeah, quiet, solitary pastimes, like reading and writing. But it reveals them to be the most potent psychological tools we possess.
Absolutely. And, if you look at the historical context, the most successful and enduring minds, they didn't view these practices as leisure, like at all. They viewed them as survival tools for their intellect.
Survival tools.
Right. I mean, think about Marcus Aurelius. He wasn't writing his Stoic meditations in a war tent just to, relax and unwind.
Right. He was running an empire.
Exactly. He was actively managing the massive psychological burden of an empire. Or Virginia Woolf, meticulously mapping her consciousness in her diaries. Or Charles Darwin.
Darwin was huge.
Obsessively utilizing both reading and journaling to synthesize his massive observations. They were not passing the time. They were actively constructing the architecture of their minds.
So if the brain is a computer, reading seems like the most obvious way to, download data into that architecture. But biologically, what is actually happening when we sit down and just stare at ink on a page? It seems so passive.
It does seem passive, but the data suggests it's a massive physiological trigger, like a profound biological hit. Yeah. So in the structural breakdown we're looking at, reading is defined as the external window. It's the ultimate form of receptive input. We tend to think of reading purely as an intellectual exercise, right?
Sure.
But the physiological response is immediate. The data shows that reading is an incredibly fast-acting stress reliever. Just 6 minutes of focused reading can lower your heart rate and ease muscle tension by up to 68%.
Wait, a 68% drop in physiological stress?
In 6 minutes.
Yes.
That is
That actually outperforms walking or listening to music for stress relief.
Okay, but how? How does the simple act of, tracking words on a page force your nervous system to calm down so dramatically?
So the mechanism lies in what neurologists call receptive attention. Consider what your brain is doing when you scroll through a digital feed on your phone.
There's a lot of panic and noise, mostly. Right. You are in a state of hypervigilant standing. Your sympathetic nervous system is slightly elevated because you're rapidly assessing micro-threats, you're looking for dopamine hits, you're processing highly fragmented information.
You're constantly bracing for the next thing.
Exactly. Deep reading, on the other hand, forces the brain into a state of singular, sustained focus. By surrendering your attention to a structured external narrative, you are stepping out of your own chaotic internal monologue.
Oh, wow.
And that specific shift signals to your nervous system that you are safe from immediate environmental threats, which drastically lowers cortisol and engages the parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest state.
So by offloading the narrative structure from your own anxious mind to the author's mind, you are effectively putting your own physiological alarm bells on pause.
That is the exact biological reality of it. And we connect this to the bigger picture. This isn't just about temporary relaxation. It actually acts as a long-term longevity tool.
Longevity,
Yep.
like living longer.
Yes. Large-scale studies analyzing reading habits reveal that regular book readers, specifically those engaging with, long-form immersive texts, they show a 20% lower mortality risk over a 12-year period compared to non-readers.
A 20% mortality reduction just from regular deep reading.
Just from reading. Because the chronic reduction in baseline stress literally extends your physical lifespan.
That really frames it less as a hobby and way more as a foundational health protocol. And beyond the physiological, there's a massive psychological upgrade happening here regarding empathy, right? Specifically what the analysis calls cognitive empathy.
Yeah, cognitive empathy. It's essentially a highly demanding workout for your brain's theory of mind.
Okay.
When you read particularly narrative nonfiction or complex fiction, you aren't just absorbing facts. You are neurologically forced to run a simulation of someone else's consciousness.
Your mirror neurons are firing.
Exactly. They're firing as if you're experiencing the events yourself. You are inhabiting a perspective, a set of motives, and a historical context completely divorced from your own.
It essentially stretches your capacity to understand human behavior. I was thinking, if you want to learn a complex skill, reading is basically the equivalent of hiring the greatest minds in human history to be your personal mentors, all for the price of a paperback.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. You get Epicurus or Toni Morrison in a room, and they just compress decades of their lived experience, their catastrophic mistakes, their hard-won wisdom into a format you can consume in an afternoon. It's literally a software update for your brain.
You're importing world-class data, which breaks you out of the isolation of your own limited perspective.
But this introduces a massive bottleneck.
How so?
Because if reading is this powerful external window bringing all this high-density data into the brain, there has to be a breaking point. I mean, you read 3 brilliant books, you absorb these complex perspectives, and suddenly your mind is just overflowing.
Right.
How does the brain actually metabolize and organize all of that imported data so it doesn't just turn into overwhelming noise?
And this is exactly where the second practice becomes absolutely non-negotiable. If reading is the external window for input, journaling is the internal mirror.
The internal mirror? Okay.
It is the active generative process of output. You can't just endlessly acquire data, you have to process it. And the clinical mechanics of this are heavily grounded in the work of psychologist James Pennebaker.
Oh, I've seen his name in the sources.
Yeah, he mapped a specific neurological function called affect labeling.
Right, affect labeling.
Yeah.
Which implies that just the act of putting a name to a feeling physically changes its nature in the brain. How does that actually work?
So when you experience a chaotic, overwhelming emotion, say severe anxiety about a career shift, maybe a complex relationship dynamic, your amygdala is firing on all cylinders.
The threat center.
Yes, that is the reactive emotional epicenter of your brain. It does not process logic. It processes threat and panic. But the moment you force yourself to pick up a pen and translate that vague, overwhelming feeling into concrete vocabulary on a physical page, you physically shift the electrical activity and blood flow in your brain.
You're moving it out of the amygdala.
Exactly. You move the processing away from the amygdala and force it into the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational, logical, executive center of the brain.
Oh, wow. So by writing down this specific sentence, like, I am feeling terrified about this career move because I lack the technical skills, you are literally pulling the emergency override switch. You're transferring the data from the brain's panic room into the control room.
Precisely. Because you are forcing abstract, chaotic electrical signals to conform to the rules of grammar, syntax, and logic.
And that requires executive function.
Exactly. And the clinical efficacy of this simple transfer is striking. Consistent expressive writing, where you're actively engaged in this affect labeling, has been shown to reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety by 20 to 45%.
20 to 45%. That level of efficacy rivals many pharmaceutical interventions.
It does. It is quite literally a biological intervention using syntax.
That's wild.
And because it drastically reduces the chronic cognitive load of carrying unexamined stress, it frees up biological resources. The medical data links this consistent processing to boosted immune function, higher antibody responses, and significantly lower baseline blood pressure.
Because it's acting as a high-efficiency brain dump. You're externalizing the threat so your brain doesn't have to burn glucose, keeping those worries looping in your short-term memory.
Exactly.
But wait, let me push back on this slightly.
Sure.
If the practice is just writing down what you are feeling, aren't we sometimes risking, like, a negative echo chamber?
Yeah.
I mean, if I sit in a room and extensively document my own anxiety without seeking any outside advice or new inputs, aren't I just building a monument to my own panic?
Yes, absolutely.
So how is rumination a cognitive upgrade?
It isn't. And that is the exact structural danger the analysis highlights. Journaling without intention or structure easily devolves into rumination.
Okay, so the sources do warn about this.
Heavily. Because if you do that, you end up endlessly rehashing the same grievances or anxieties without generating any forward momentum. You are staring into the internal mirror and just obsessing over the smudge on the glass.
Right. It becomes a loop of passive observation rather than active generative problem solving.
Exactly. You're digging the cognitive rut deeper by reinforcing those neural pathways of anxiety.
Yeah.
And this reveals the severe consequences of practicing either of these habits in total isolation. If you only journal without ever reading, you fall into that self-referential trap. You're trying to build a house using only the materials you already have.
Which isn't enough.
Right. But if you only read without ever journaling, you fall victim to the opposite problem, a very modern psychological condition identified as intellectual obesity.
Intellectual obesity, that is quite the term. It implies a severe accumulation of knowledge without any metabolic burn.
It is the state of being completely cognitively bloated. You are constantly consuming information. You're downloading podcasts, reading dense nonfiction, subscribing to a dozen newsletters.
Guilty.
Right, we all are. But you remain fundamentally unchanged in your daily behavior. It breeds this checkbox mentality where we treat profound knowledge as just items on a digital to-do list.
We consume simply to say we have consumed.
Yes. The analysis calls this intellectual bypassing. You accumulate vast amounts of theoretical knowledge, but consistently fail to apply it to your own behavioral patterns or your own blind spots.
It's basically the equivalent of going to a high-end market, buying the most nutrient-dense, expensive raw ingredients, stuffing them into your refrigerator, and then, like, ordering fast food every single night.
That is exactly what it is.
You have hoarded all the potential energy required for a better life, but because you refuse to do the actual work of preparing and synthesizing it, you are still starving for real change.
That highlights the exact failure to convert potential energy into kinetic energy. We are a society starved for actionable wisdom, but absolutely drowning in information.
Drowning in it.
And what's fascinating here is that the antidote to this specific modern paralysis is structured journaling, framed fundamentally as an act of digital asceticism.
Digital asceticism, meaning taking a deliberate vow of technological poverty to reclaim your own thought process.
Exactly.
But why is the physical act of writing the necessary countermeasure to the digital landscape?
Because of the velocity and the intentionality of the medium. We live in an era governed by algorithms that are constantly force-feeding you context.
Right.
They're telling you what's important and dictating exactly how you should feel about it.
Yeah, you open an app and you're immediately told what to be outraged by today.
Exactly. The speed of digital consumption drastically outpaces our ability to critically evaluate it. But putting a physical pen to physical paper is a radical act of slowing down. It forces you to operate at the speed of human thought rather than algorithmic distribution.
I like that.
It is the ultimate tool for claiming self-sovereignty over your own mind. It allows you to establish your actual beliefs before a curated news cycle colonizes your perspective.
So you're basically building a firewall between your own mind and the endless influx of external demands.
Yes. And the dynamic is broken down in the sources into a very unforgiving formula. Reading without thinking is simply noise. It is just more data passing through the system. Thinking without writing is a fog. It's a chaotic swirl of unresolved ideas and anxieties.
Right.
But writing is crystallized thought. It is the only way to solidify the abstract into the concrete.
Okay, so if doing one without the other inevitably traps you in the noise or the fog, the solution obviously has to be a structural integration of both.
Which brings us to the core synthesis of the source material, the intellectual respiratory system. To achieve self-fulfillment and actual cognitive growth, you must treat these activities precisely like biological breathing.
Breathing, okay.
Reading is the inhale. It is the intake of potential energy from the outside world. Journaling is the exhale. It is the necessary conversion of that potential energy into localized kinetic energy.
Because the biological absolute is that you cannot hold your breath indefinitely.
Exactly.
If you just inhale constantly, if you only read, consume, listen, your lungs burst. You suffer from intellectual obesity. Conversely, if you just exhale constantly, if you only journal without exposing yourself to new ideas, you run out of oxygen and suffocate in that rumination echo chamber.
You require the rhythm, you must maintain the respiratory loop. And the consensus models provide a highly specific, optimal ratio to actually metabolize complex information. They suggest that to achieve genuine behavioral change, your cognitive diet should consist of a 70% journaling and 30% high-quality reading ratio.
Wait, a 70-30 ratio heavily biased toward writing.
Yes.
So what does this all mean for someone's day-to-day? Because if we look at the pure mechanics of time, reading a chapter of dense philosophy inherently takes considerably longer than jotting down a few notes. So this 70-30 split can't possibly be a measure of minutes on a clock.
Definitely not.
So how does a busy professional actually implement that imbalance? What does that 70% even refer to?
You're completely correct. It's absolutely about the distribution of cognitive weight and the value extracted. It's not a stopwatch exercise. The framework ensures that the vast majority of your psychological energy is spent metabolizing and applying the input, rather than just endlessly acquiring more of it. To execute this, the protocol relies on a specific read, think, journal feedback loop.
Walk me through the loop.
Step 1 is the inhale. Read a small, highly intentional amount of material. Do not binge read to hit some arbitrary page quota.
Right, gather a manageable amount of high-density raw material, and then the most critical part of the loop has to be stopping the input.
Exactly. Step 2 is exactly that. Close the book.
Yeah.
You have to physically step away from the external window to break the illusion that mere consumption equals progress. You have to shut off the supply of potential energy.
Close the window. Got it.
Then, step 3 is the exhale, journaling. But keeping your earlier point in mind, this is not an unstructured brain dump where you risk rumination. You use the mirror to answer 3 very specific prompts regarding the small amount of material you just consumed.
What are the 3 prompts that force the crystallization of the thought?
Number 1, what did I actually learn? This forces recall and ensures you actually comprehended the concept.
Okay.
Number 2, do I agree with it? This forces critical thinking and self-sovereignty, preventing you from blindly adopting someone else's dogma.
Love that.
And number 3, which is arguably the most vital, how will I apply this specific insight to my life today? By spending your analytical energy on that final reflection, you are turning a small 30% input into massive 70% behavioral change.
That entirely reframes how we should evaluate productivity. I mean, instead of feeling a false sense of failure because you only read 10 pages of a book today.
Right.
You recognize those 10 pages are just the unrefined ore. The actual work happens when you close the book and execute the writing process. Like, you read a chapter on stoic detachment, and instead of just flipping to the next chapter, you stop and write. I learned about separating my reaction from external events. Do I agree? Mostly, though it requires practice. How will I apply it? Well, the next time my client sends an unreasonable demand, I will force a 60-second physical pause before touching my keyboard.
Yes.
You've synthesized ancient philosophy into a localized, immediate behavioral protocol.
That is the exact conversion of potential energy into kinetic energy.
Yeah.
You read the great minds to expand the parameters of who you could become, and you rigorously journal to excavate, challenge, and solidify who you are. It is a perfectly balanced life design.
It is an incredibly elegant, closed-loop system. However, the analysis introduces one final necessary progression, doesn't it?
It does.
Because we have the window of reading to inhale the world, and we have the mirror of journaling to organize the mind. But if you stop there, you've essentially just built a perfectly optimized solitary confinement cell. You are still trapped entirely inside your own head.
Exactly. Which is why the sources introduce the third and final pillar required to completely close the cycle of mastery. They refer to it as the door.
The door, the physical threshold between the internal architecture and the external world.
Precisely. The door represents physical action and social integration. Because true well-being and cognitive health, they cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires taking the metabolized wisdom out of the private notebook and forcing it into reality.
So writing down your protocol for handling a difficult client is the mirror. Actually executing that emotional regulation in the meeting is walking through the door.
You've got it. The respiratory cycle isn't finished until the oxygen actually reaches the muscles and causes movement. The door means engaging in high-focus physical movement to ground the nervous system, or stepping up to actively mentor others. You take the cognitive empathy you painstakingly develop through reading, the emotional clarity and rational control you gain through journaling, and you apply those upgraded tools in the service of your community and your own physical reality.
So for you, listening right now, whether you're prepping for a high-stakes meeting this week or you are actively trying to navigate digital burnout and detox from the algorithm dictating your attention, you now possess the complete mechanics of the intellectual respiratory system.
It's all there.
Read small, high-density amounts to bring in the potential energy. Close the book, journal on those 3 specific prompts to crystallize your thoughts, and then open the door and execute the plan in the physical world. Read to expand who you could become. Journal to excavate who you are.
And, as we look at how deeply our internal writing shapes our cognitive software, it introduces a rather profound implication for the future. A final provocative thought, if you will, that builds on all of this.
Oh, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
We know that journaling acts as an internal mirror, right? It captures our deepest behavioral patterns, our synthesized wisdom, and our emotional baseline over time.
Right.
Consider what happens as we move into an era where we can train personalized AI models on our own data. If you spend decades meticulously crystallizing your thoughts in a journal, you are essentially writing the ultimate training manual for a digital twin.
Wait, really?
Yes. Your daily exhales could eventually power an algorithm that understands your cognitive blind spots, your unique stress triggers, and your ideal decision-making frameworks better than you do in the moment.
That is a staggering concept.
Yeah.
I mean, we use reading to download the wisdom of history's greatest minds, but by diligently journaling, we are actively coding the data set for an intelligence that will eventually mentor us using our own metabolized wisdom.
Exactly. If reading allows you to mentor under the greatest minds in history, consider this. What if the most important book you will ever read is the one you are currently writing in your journal? After all, it's the only manuscript on Earth custom-tailored to solve your exact life.
Oh, absolutely. The daily practice doesn't just upgrade your brain today, it builds the cognitive architecture for the systems that will sustain you tomorrow. You are literally writing the source code for your future self.
Precisely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. It is time to step away from the noise, close the book, open the notebook, and start writing.